Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean, and today we are talking about Horrified, and it is fittingly going to be a bit of a double feature, or a creature feature, if you will. And so first of all, we are going to be talking about the newest Horrified World of Monsters, and we were provided with a copy for review of that one, but then we are going to be ranking all of the Horrified games. So we're going to be comparing them in a bunch of different categories, and then telling you which one we like best.
Horrified World of Monsters is designed by Peter Lee and Michael Mulvihill. And like the other Horrifieds, you are heroes and you're going to be moving around town, saving villagers, fighting monsters, and ultimately trying to save the world. But if you haven't played any Horrifieds, let's start with looking at how it plays.
You start the game with a character, a perk card, and a town full of monsters. On your turn, you take the number of actions indicated on your character tile and use them to do things like move, pick up items, guide villagers, reveal lair tiles, advance monster challenges, and defeat monsters. After each turn, you flip a card from the monster deck, which will cause some kind of event to happen and move the monsters, who will usually attack you and the villagers when they enter your space. If the monsters knock out anybody, the terror track increases. You lose the game if the terror track ever reaches the last space, or if the monster deck runs out. You win if you defeat all of the monsters before time runs out, and the village is saved once more.
So for Horrified World of Monsters specifically, you are fighting, it's called a World of Monsters, but it's specifically including 4 monsters, and the biggest one here is Cthulhu, which introduces a bit of a new concept with it being a big boss, because the second level that you fight is definitely a lot more in-depth than all the other monsters.
Yeah, this is the first monster that they've had that has 2 different levels to it, and it takes a little bit of doing to beat both of those levels. It is maybe a little bit easier to get through that first level than you first think that it is. So it's not quite like the huge problem that it might be, but it definitely, the nice thing about it is it gives kind of this big moment at the end of the game, because that's probably going to be the last one you beat, and it's got its own little board. So all of that stuff's nice. And the other 3 monsters are the Yeti and the Sphinx and Jiangshi. And those, I think, all have nice little mechanics that are a little bit different than what we've seen in the other games. And I'm just impressed that they're, 22 monsters in now, and they're still thinking of different things. But this does only have 4 monsters, whereas all of the other boxes have 6.
Yeah, and so you won't be able to mix and match nearly as much because you'll often be playing with the same monsters. And like you said, I do like the other ones as well. I really like the little Yetis. They're really adorable. Mm-hmm. And so the other 3, I think, are a little bit simpler, but still interesting puzzles that you're solving. And I think what's neat is because it's this Lovecraftian theme, you've also have this big void in the center. And what that means, it seems like a lot of movement happens through the center. So I think as a result of that, the monsters end up clumping a lot, and it's going to make going into the void more dangerous because you're going to be a pretty easy target.
And you said you don't mix up as much, which is true if you're just using this box, but this one is the first one that can connect with other ones. So it only connects with Greek monsters, which is kind of too bad, because I wish it connected with American monsters, because thematically they're a lot more similar, but you can mix and match those. So if you have those, you can mix and match those monsters. But if you are generally playing at 3 or 4 monsters, if you're generally playing at the hard level of 4 monsters, you're just going to use them all every game. And if you're playing at the 3 monsters, you're just going to have 1 that shifts out. So that's a little bit too bad. Also with the theme, that Lovecraftian vibe, which I'm not into, it's not for me at all. But it is mixed with a steampunk thing. So the town is kind of steampunk, all the cards are steampunk, and I love that side of it.
Yeah, I particularly like the perk cards because all of the perk cards are these steampunk inventions. So I think they look really cool. So I found myself looking at those, I think, more than other perk cards in the past as well. And who you're fighting with in terms of your heroes, There are only 5 heroes. I think some other boxes have more, but I did find they introduced a couple of new ones, which again, after seeing a whole slew, is interesting that there's still kind of slightly new things you can do with your hero.
Yeah, because Universal and American have exactly the same hero powers in those two. And this one copies a few from Greek, but the Buccaneer especially has got interesting things. But we'll come back to that when we go through our rankings, because we're going to break that down category by category. But overall, what do you think about just if we're taking World of Monsters on its own, and if this is kind of maybe the first one that you're going into? What do you think about this one?
If this is the first one you're going into, I think you'll like it if you like Horrified as a system. It keeps the same system, the cooperative game, the relatively easy entry level. I think the monsters, excluding Cthulhu, are pretty easy to wrap your head around, which, if this is the first time you're playing a Horrified game, is important. But Cthulhu, I think if you've played it once and then you've got a sense of it, I don't think it's going to be that complicated. It will just add that extra level of a bigger fight at the end, which is interesting. But having only 4 monsters, I mean, if you haven't played the other ones, I guess maybe you don't know what you're missing.
Yeah. If you don't know, and I will say that they're easier to wrap your head. The other 3 are easier to wrap your head around, but not necessarily easier to beat. I think the Yeti is probably pretty easy to beat, but the other 2 are a little bit complicated, and we've definitely had our games coming down to that last second, which is always what you want with these. And I think over the whole series, they've done such a good job with that balance, and I think that definitely is not lost here. But the Cthulhu, we did have to look up a few little clarifications for.
I think who this is mostly going to be for are for Cthulhu fans. I think like all of the Horrifieds, it's really the theme that draws you in. Mm-hmm. So if you like Cthulhu, then this is definitely a Cthulhu theme.
And if you want your 121st Cthulhu game, if you're like 120 Cthulhu games, not quite enough.
And also if you like Horrified as a system, if you have loved all of the Horrifieds and you want more Horrified, it is more Horrified.
That's definitely us. We're completionists, and we're like, oh, another one. We love this series, so we were happy to get another one in this series. But let's talk about this series. So we are going to break it down a bunch of different categories. We're going to tell you our favorite in each of those categories. Then we are going to rank them. Don't just jump to the rankings, though. Let's go through this as a journey together, and then all arrive at that destination. But let's start out with the heroes.
So like we were just talking about for World of Monsters, I think the powers are interesting. I think they look really cool too. I think these are the most non-generic looking heroes of the bunch, but there are fewer of them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, there's only 5. There are generally 7. I believe there's 7 in all of the other boxes, and there's 5 in this box. There might be 8. I'm not positive. But yeah, they do have really cool powers, and they look awesome. Like the Buccaneer, who's this skeleton pirate, looks really cool. The Guardian, who's this clockwork robot. So I'm really into the style of them. I think that's really good. Talking about some of the other ones, Universal was that, so this is the first heroes, and they were just a little bit generic, and that was a little bit of a disappointment because they had the licenses. So I would have loved to have seen Van Helsing being one of those heroes or other characters from the movies.
And the 1950s one, I do like that it leans into 1950s. So you get the jock sports player and those various stereotypes and just the 1950s look overall. But again, it's just no one specific. And the same thing with Greek too, is it isn't a specific heroes because those will come into the legends that we'll talk about later.
Right. But the legends don't have Perseus, and that could have been one of again, like Universal, they could have used some of the actual heroes. One thing I like in American though is that there's one investigator who I think is meant to be kind of based on Dale Cooper. There's a few little Twin Peaksy things in there. We're going to come back to that. I'm a Twin Peaks nut. But which one is your favorite then of the 4?
So I am going to go with World of Monsters being my favorite, but with the caveat that I do wish they had just included a couple more.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the ones they have in there are some of the best in the series, but 2 more would have made it by far the best one. Now it just ekes it out for me. But that is, World of Monsters is our number 1 in that category.
So looking at villagers and who you're trying to protect, I'm going to start with the OG with Universal. I really, really like that they included the villagers from the films, because before we started playing, you made me go back and watch them. And I love that they mishmashed all of those movies together to create the shared world. And part of that is having the people from those movies as the villagers.
Yeah, especially Abbott and Costello. It's great seeing Abbott and Costello in there. That one's fantastic. And then American monsters, they are a little bit more generic, but again, I really think that there's some Twin Peaks references hidden in there, because if you look at the sheriff, he looks a lot like Sheriff Harry S. Truman here. He's Sheriff Ford, which is another president. And I got a feeling also Nora from the diner. I looked on BGG. I'm not the only one to have these thoughts, so I was glad to see that. So there is a little bit of that in there.
And World of Monsters, I think they're all generic as well. I didn't specifically recognize anyone. It is interesting though, because there is some crossover too, because there's a Mari in the
in American Monsters,
and there's also one, and it's the same one. I'm like, who is this Mari?
Yeah, and there's a like Harold Birdman, or Owlman, which I really like to see as well. Which I didn't even think of as kind of a Harvey Birdman thing, obviously, Owlman. And I also didn't mention that American Monsters has Willy Loman from Death of a Salesman, which I'd like to see as well. But the Greek Monsters has all of them are characters that we know. So you've got all of these characters from Greek mythology. You've got Daedalus and Io and Arachne and all of these interesting characters. And so that's the one that I like the most, because although Universal, we know those characters, I know a little bit more, I think, about the Greek monsters characters, because I've read so much of that stuff or seen the movies. And yeah, so I really connect to those.
So our preferred one for the villagers / legends in this case is Horrified Greek Monsters.
So let's talk about maps. And the maps are more interesting than you'd think, because at first we were like, oh, are they all the same? And then we looked at it. Absolutely not. There are totally different layouts, and there's a few different things that went into this for us. So one is the artwork, and there's two different things. One is the artwork and one is the layout. And so let's talk about American Monsters first of all. And American Monsters, I love the look of it. It's got this 50s theme. The nice thing is you can immediately find the things. So when you look at the card and it says diner, look for a diner, and then you find a diner, or the abandoned mine, or the cemetery. We just know what those look like. I don't necessarily know what the Temple of Dusk looks like in like the new one, or there's a few things, or in Greek Monsters too, there's a few things that I just don't immediately recognize, where in this one I do.
Yeah, I would say for both the Greek Monsters and World of Monsters that's the case, because I do really like the steampunk look and the steampunk buildings in World of Monsters, but we do have a harder time finding those locations. I do like the void at the center, because again, things tend to just end up going in that direction, so that's interesting. And for Greek Monsters, I like that everything has a few more offshoots. You get a lot of places where it takes like 2 movements to come back to a branching path, and having so many of those dead ends costs you more movements, and I think increases the difficulty in an interesting way a little bit.
Yeah, Greek Monsters, I find myself a lot more off on a little alcove, a little dead-end alcove, and we run out of time more just by getting to places, whereas World of Monsters, we get smashed more and run out of life more by all being jumbled in one place and having all the monsters converge upon us. And so it's interesting that it is those two different styles. And then Universal, which is the first one, is a little bit more of kind of a sensible town layout. It's a little bit in the middle of all of it.
Yeah, I will say though, I really like that it combined all of those movie worlds together, because it is locations from all of the different movies, and it's taken these very specific locations and has made it one town, which I think is really interesting. But the overall winner, taking into all of those considerations, we are going to go with American Monsters, really because of that 1950s art style tips it over the edge.
Yeah, and I like that it's just kind of a sensible town layout as well, and it feels like it's got a little bit more life to it for me. So moving on to one that we keep on touching on, which is theme. And this is probably going to be the biggest driver for which one of these you buy. And so this is going to be different for different folks, but which one do we like most? And it's a little bit of a toss-up. So first of all, American Monsters, that has got the ones from, kind of mythology, but it's neat because it's like more modern urban mythologies. So there's stuff like the Jersey Devil, Bigfoot, the Banshee of the Badlands, who we haven't heard of, Chupacabra, who's also an excellent Chicks Dig It song, which is a punk band from Calgary if you don't know them. And so there is a little bit of connection for me to those monsters.
For World of Monsters, they said the name before we knew anything about it, so we kind of built up different expectations in our head than what it actually was. You thought it was going to be stuff from the Monsterverse, and I thought it would be like a whole range of monsters. So then when it was just 4, it kind of wasn't the same expectation. But in terms of the theme, it is Cthulhu theme, but then also introducing other mythological creatures from around the world a little bit.
Yeah, and the Cthulhu's a negative for me. I'm just not into it at all. But the other 3 are positives for me, but it feels a little bit like kind of American Monsters Part 2. Like it kind of connects. And I wish that they had done, maybe one from Africa and one from Polynesia and one from South America or something, that they'd really done a world of monsters. That would have been cool. For Universal, well, that's, it's the Universal Monsters. It's Dracula, it's Frankenstein, it's the Wolfman. There's such immediate connection to those monsters.
Yeah, and if you love those movies, this is going to be a theme that draws you in. If you haven't seen those movies, then
you should watch them, especially Bride of Frankenstein.
You should watch them, but then you might just think of those monsters pretty much like the other monsters, of just kind of these bad guys that you don't have like necessarily much of a connection to if you haven't seen it. Whereas for the Greek monsters, I mean, we both really like Greek mythology, and so it plays into the Greek monsters.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with Universal. We've got a lot of connection to these already. We're really interested in them. So that's really, I think, for us, the 1 and 2, but it's got to be Universal. There was never any doubt. It's got to be.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the movies, go and watch the movies. And so another category we're looking at is components, and that's kind of overall quality components, artwork a little bit as well. And so starting with the original one, this was the first one. I think the art style's a little bit simpler, and I think part of that is because of the tie-in to these older movies. I do like the different items, because you get the coffins for Dracula, the dials for Frankenstein, and all of those kind of things. But the minis, I think, most of them tend to lean a little bit.
Yeah, especially our Dracula he's fully limboing. He's ready to limbo. But I do generally like it. I love that one's got a cloth bag. It's the only one with a cloth bag. And then they went to this other, I don't know what it's made of. It works fine, but I love a cloth bag.
It's not a cloth bag.
Yeah. Greek monsters, I feel like generally the components are really solid, except that they went with 3 colors for items and 2 of them are blue. So they got blue and then bluer. Or the blue is kind of an aqua greeny blue, but boy, I don't have any color blindness problems, and I have a lot of, I need to see both to be able to compare to know which one's which. So that just is a bit of a hit on it. Other than that, it's super solid.
Yeah, when you only have 3 colors, just make those 3 colors different.
Yeah.
For World of Monsters, it does look pretty good. I think the sculpts overall are pretty good.
Probably the best in the series, I think.
Yeah, and I do like the little Yeti cubs. But for the Cthulhu, when you stand it up, they just don't have the notches for it to be secured in place. It's such a minor little thing, but also feels like such an easy little fix.
It's such a weird thing not to do. Yeah, so every time when there's a cardboard standee and you got little cardboard things, we all know that there's little notches that go in there so that they stick together. It doesn't have it. So those bottom feet just fall off all the time. It's the only negative we really have for it, because the art style is really cool with the steampunk. Everything else is cool, but it drives me crazy. And then American Monsters, we really like the art. It's really pretty, and I feel like they did a good job of finding that theme and carrying it all the way through. And there's, just like the original Universal, I think did a nice job of finding little moments to add a bit more of that theme. And I think American also does a really good job of that.
Yeah, I will say that they have a brown and a yellow as 2 of their item colors. Again, a little similar. And I think this one is an example of the minis sometimes looking not great. But I think across the board, the minis aren't going to be these high quality, high detail minis.
Right.
Just to bear in mind.
And they are still good. The Bigfoot especially is great.
Yeah, that is true. So all of them have these little caveats. So for our winner, we ended up picking American because of that art style.
Yeah, I think American Monsters, it just I love the look of all of the little bits. Kind of pulls me into that theme, even though it's not a theme I'm as into, which I think is the even more impressive thing. So then finally, we are talking about the monsters, and it's pretty impossible to totally divorce them from theme, but we are also largely talking about how they work mechanically in the different games too. So to start off with American Monsters, I think this one, definitely it's the most ambitious. It's got these really like more complex monsters. A lot of them, you can't even fit all of the information on the cards. You got to look back at the book to learn them. And that's kind of a double-edged sword where it's great because you've got some of these really, really interesting ones. The ones like the Jersey Devil, who's one of the actual people who are moving around the board, but you're not sure who, and you've got to figure out and solve that mystery. That one is really cool. Bigfoot, I still don't know if we fully understand, and looking at the internet, it feels like that is a pretty common experience with that one.
And looking at World of Monsters, I really like the 3 non-Cthulhu monsters. I think they're interesting puzzles, but straightforward, still different from the other monsters. And I like the idea of a big boss. I think that is really interesting. And I think this one would be stronger if there were just more monsters included.
Yeah, it's just too bad that there's only 4 monsters. It's a little bit like what we've seen with Villainous, that it went from this box with lots to boxes with 3 to boxes with 1, and I'm not that into that. Like, just give us a whole bunch of monsters. And then looking at Greek monsters, I think these ones are really smooth across the board. They have really interesting mechanics to them, but everything's on the boards. They're all pretty easy to understand. And I like that they added the layers in that one too.
Yeah, and then looking at the original one, I really like those monsters. I think it ties in for the most part really well to theme. I like that the Invisible Man is a challenge and just pops up out of nowhere, stealing all of the items. I think smashing the coffins is neat, and then the little puzzle for the mummy, that's interesting too. So I think each of them do feel quite different, and as a first intro to the whole system, I think it did a really good job of capturing these different monsters with what is a really straightforward system of just using items to try and defeat them.
Yeah, and I think it does maybe the best job of having things on different ends of the spectrum too, where you've got the Invisible Man and the Mummy, which are a little bit more complex. The Invisible Man's not that complex, but he's just a pain in the butt. And then you've got like Dracula is a little bit easier, and the Wolfman's a little bit easier, and then the creatures actually also quite difficult, and the Frankensteins are a little bit easier, but I love them thematically. That you just got to bring them together in love. That's really nice too. So in the end, I think Greek really gives it a run for its money in terms of those monsters because they are so smooth, but I think it's got to be Universal.
Yeah, Universal has a great mix of difficulty, and it's the one we connect with the most.
So taking all of that stuff into account, it's time to give our final rankings. And so what is at number 4?
So at the bottom, I think American Monsters. I like that they tried to do different things, but I think the monsters are a little bit more like convoluted than like more interesting.
I actually have World of Monsters at the bottom, and that's partly due to the theme, but it's also partly because there's less. There's just generally a little bit less overall in it. I like that it connects to Greek monsters, but I actually like that they kind of went out on a limb and were a little bit more ambitious with the American ones, even if not all of them hit. So I've got World at the bottom and then American at 3. So we're going to do those as a combined 3.5, but at number 2, what do you have?
Well, this is going to give away what my number 1 is, but at number 2, I have Horrified Greek Monsters. I really love the theme, and I think the monsters are smoother than in American Monsters, but still interesting, and just connecting with like the legends and all of that lore is really interesting.
Yeah, I really like Greek Monsters. I think that they nailed it with that one, and I think you could really get Greek or Universal as your first box and be super happy. So whichever one you like more, I think those are both like getting pretty equal, but I definitely agree. Greek at number 2, which means our number 1 is Universal, and there was never going to be a surprise. If you've ever watched the channel, you know how much we love Universal monsters. I love the theme, but mechanically, I still think it is maybe the best one. There's an argument to be made for some of the other ones. American's more complex, Greek's a little bit smoother. The new one's got that double layer for the one monster, but Universal just hits it out of the park for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a huge thing is having watched those movies while we were playing it. I think if I hadn't seen those movies and didn't have the connection with the theme, I may have gone with Greek because I knew that theme better. But having watched the movies, having all of the villagers be characters from the movies, having the locations on the board tie into that whole world is really what makes it my number one.
And that is it. That is our rankings for Horrified. Please let us know yours in the comments. Also, let us know what you'd like to see next in the series, because I know I would love to see slashers, and I've seen a lot of those on BGG, a lot of homebrewed ones, but I would love to see Michael and Jason and Freddy and Chucky in a box, or the actual Monsterverse, which is what we thought World of Monsters was going to be, but I would love to see that. King Kong, Godzilla, Mothra, all of that stuff together in a box. That would be, and that would be huge. That would be amazing.
As usual, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.
Right. Okay, so we gotta do a huge chunk.
Oh no!
Maybe actually the entire thing. I maybe never put it on.